lovely to be here. I'm really excited to be here presenting some of my PhD research. I should probably note that I'm not a doctor yet, but I'm working on it. So I'm doing my PhD. I'll take you to the first slide. So you can see here that the presentation today is titled Threats Against Satellite Ground Infrastructure, a retrospective analysis of sophisticated attacks. And this is a short study that I conducted, which is part of a short paper that was accepted within the NDSS symposium within the sort of space security working group within there. So this is part of the research that I conduct, and I conduct this as a cybersecurity CDT, or Centre for Doctoral Training, student at the University of Bath and the University of Bristol in the UK. As mentioned, I have quite a sort of multidisciplinary background in terms of I did an undergraduate actually in politics and international relations, and then since then I've joined a more technical cybersecurity course, and so I combine that kind of slightly social with slightly technical background to create research on space infrastructure. I'm supervised, as mentioned, by Avais Rashid, and he helped me with this study that I'm presenting to you today. Just to let you know, this will be the sort of content of the presentation. So firstly, I'll talk you through the specific objectives of this paper, so why we did this study in this paper. And then I'll talk to you a little bit about the methodology that was used to conduct the study, some initial insights which were emerged from the findings, some key vulnerabilities of space infrastructure, and then finally, I'll leave you with some takeaways. So just to get started, here are the objectives. So you can see here that firstly, the aim of this study was to sort of further develop literature which surrounds cyber attacks against satellite systems, but that's quite broad. So more specifically, with this study especially, I'm concerned by the ground infrastructure. Now I can imagine that most of you are familiar with the architecture or the infrastructure of satellite systems, but very briefly, we've got the space segment, which is the satellites that are up in the sky. We've got the user segment, which is where the signals are transmitted from the satellites down to user terminals, maybe on your phone, maybe on vessels, aeroplanes and such. And then you've got the ground segment. Now, this is a really interesting segment because this is where satellite systems are monitored and operated from, but it's also where the management of extended sort of services is managed as well. So by that I mean, for example, with satellite broadband, that kind of ground segment is really important because that's also sort of managing the internet modems, maybe thousands of internet modems which are distributed globally. So for this one in particular, I wanted to bring in the importance of ground infrastructure as an attack vector. This worries me especially because if people can get into the ground infrastructure of satellite systems, then that could be especially concerning because these are typically sort of wider scale attacks because they could actually, move satellites and impact the wider connected infrastructure as well. So I wanted to aid the development of defensive measures which protect satellite systems from the ground and also provide initial input for national risk strategies, as you can see, regarding satellite security by highlighting any sort of key weak points. So on to the methodology. So the methodology for this study was to essentially map attacks against attacks which have already happened since, as you can see, since 2018. So these attacks have already happened, including the FRIP campaign, the CYSAT attack, has everyone heard of that one, which took place in 22. But also there was an attack by Volt Typhoon, which is an actor group, and Peach Sandstorm as well. So what I wanted to do was take these attacks that have happened, these are empirical examples of attacks against satellite infrastructure, and map them against an existing cyber attack analysis framework. Now, I did have a choice of a few different frameworks, but the one I chose was the Mitra attack for ICS. Now, I can imagine that some of you with the cyber background will be familiar with that framework. The reason why I picked this one was because satellite infrastructure does share a lot of similarities with other types of industrial control systems. They also have their own unique vulnerabilities and their unique features, but in particular, there's some sort of software and hardware that's shared with other types of industrial control systems, which made this analysis appropriate. And so the criteria that I had for choosing these attacks, which were chosen out of a longer list, were that they were intended to be large scale, which of course is open to interpretation, but large scale meaning impacting quite a lot of people. They were conducted by a nation state actor or associated actor, and they were also sophisticated due to having those resources and capabilities, that's associated with nation state actors. So you can see that that's just a news article about the FRIP campaign. So that's what I did. I mapped these attacks against the MITRE ATT&CK for ICS framework. So you can see here that some of the initial insights that emerged from mapping against the MITRE ATT&CK for ICS. Well, essentially what happened was I looked at the different categories within MITRE, which I should have included in the slideshow, but I did not. And some of the stages within the MITRE ATT&CK for ICS emerged as more relevant for these attacks against satellite infrastructure, probably more relevant than they would have for other types of critical infrastructure. So I've just included a couple of common steps here because I'd like you to read the full paper and then you can get the full picture of, of my findings. But some of the attack steps that I found was so one of them was initial access. And so with this one, you can see here that, of course, attackers needed to initially access the satellite infrastructure in order to then conduct further attacks. And some of the attack types you can see here, you would also see in other types of infrastructure. So you will have seen that people can use spear phishing and password spray attacks to conduct attacks against other types of infrastructure, but they also used it in this case for satellite systems or satellite operating infrastructure. Another one was, which was quite interesting, was persistence. And this is interesting because once again, the attackers use some of the software or some of the methods that you might expect to see in attacks against other types of infrastructure, but such as SEDNIT, web shell, and legitimate software as well, actually, such as that which you can see. But it was interesting that attackers wanted to not only get into this this sort of infrastructure, this central infrastructure related to satellite systems, but they wanted to stay in there. And in some cases for many months. So they stayed in there for a long period of time. And what were they doing? Observing, probably, collecting data, learning about the systems. And so that was another trend that I saw. And then after that, as I say, this is just an example of more trends that are revealed in the paper. But another one was privilege escalation. So attackers didn't just enter the infrastructure and look at the infrastructure, but they also escalated their credentials within that. And actually, in one case, that was quite easy for them to do because the same credentials were used for standard accounts as were used for emergency accounts. And that meant that they could very easily, increase their privileges. And so they were able to exploit that vulnerability and regain their privileges, gain higher credentials. So you can see here that these were some of the steps that I found. As I mentioned, this is just a sort of a brief presentation about some of the findings, and you can find more in-depth information in the paper. So another thing that I noticed was that MITRE ATT&CK for ICS does not in particular have a step which encapsulates the attacker's focus on the operational aspects of satellite systems. So satellite systems, by which I mean, of course, the extended ground infrastructure relating to them, contains both information technology, operational technology, of course, like other critical infrastructure, but for this one in particular, attackers were more interested in the operational side, and by which I mean some of the operational software which relates to the act of doing as opposed to just collecting data. And so for this reason, I proposed the addition of satellite operations access, which is maybe another stage in the MITRE framework, which encapsulates this focus on the operational side of the infrastructure. So my findings also revealed some key vulnerabilities in relation to satellite infrastructure. So as I mentioned, some of satellite systems do share some vulnerabilities with other types of industrial control systems, and that's that came out in this analysis, and also we saw a little bit of that in the first presentations in this session too, because you can use some of the same methods to analyze satellite infrastructure as you can other types of ICS. But I would argue that they do sometimes have different kinds of manifestations. So they might have different legacy systems, which are quite frankly more concerning because we're talking about systems which relate to infrastructure that's in the sky orbiting around other infrastructure, as opposed to maybe just a water treatment plant which can't physically collide with another water treatment plant. And then there's also the supply chains, which are especially sort of complex when it comes to space infrastructure, because again, I mean, we saw earlier in the really brilliant presentations about the long process that it takes for a satellite system to be constructed, manufactured, before it even reaches space, before it even reaches the point of launching. And within each of those stages, in which they're manufactured and the different parts which compose them are manufactured, there are suppliers involved who can bring in vulnerabilities which can then be exploited by attackers. So then there are also unique vulnerabilities related to satellite infrastructure. One of them, which you can see at the bottom there, is of course that the satellites themselves, the systems up in orbit, are not physically accessible. So it's not possible for you to, it's possible but not very easily, to walk around a satellite constellation and check for physical faults or physical signs of issues, or indeed to fix things which need sort of physically fixing, because you cannot reach them so easily. And so when you have created your satellite system, when you have created the satellites themselves, and they're in orbit, physical access becomes much more challenging. And you compare that to other types of critical infrastructure, in which you, for example, I take the example of a water treatment plant again. It's possible for you to walk around, have a look, see what lights are flashing, what faults are emerging, and it's a lot easier to get a good picture of what's going wrong, versus satellite infrastructure, where you really have to trust what you can see on the ground in order to know what's going on up there. And once again, if an issue happens, then you really are dependent on that link between ground and space. And then another sort of vulnerability which emerged from the analysis is the centralization of satellite infrastructure. So at least in the UK, I know that there are measures in place which ensure that if there is a power outage, for instance, within the electricity grid, so if one area loses power, there are measures in place to keep that localized. So there are measures in place to ensure that a local power outage does not become a national or global power outage. But with space infrastructure, that cannot, at least at the moment, really easily be replicated. So as I mentioned very briefly earlier with the Viasat attack, so attackers were able to exploit vulnerabilities within Viasat's KSAT network. And when they did that, they were able to access the admin or sort of management segments within the control element of that network. And through that, they were able to access tens of thousands of modems, and essentially disrupt tens of thousands of modems, which means disrupting satellite broadband for tens of thousands of people. Now, this is a really widespread disruption. They, of course, at least my analysis emerged that they intended initially to disrupt Ukraine's ground military communications, a couple of days before Russia invaded Ukraine. But they ended up disrupting many thousands of people across Europe, extending to even wind turbine farms in Germany. So this kind of global nature of attacks against satellite systems is especially concerning. And it's a unique vulnerability, because if attackers can get into that ground infrastructure, and they can have control and they can manipulate sort of procedures that are taking place on the ground, they might be able to have access to extended ground infrastructure across land, but also within space as well. And that's because of this centralization of the management of satellite systems. And this is another sort of vulnerability that emerged from the analysis. you can see here that the key sort of takeaways that you might get from this is that this research further advances the research area generally of cybersecurity and satellite systems for analysis of empirical examples and bringing in that analysis of attacks which have taken place. A lot of research is really brilliant and takes place in terms of what could go wrong, and I thought that I would take a different perspective, have a look at what has gone wrong, which is of course it's for me, it's really interesting, but it's also very concerning. Satellite system attacks can also have wider spread consequences than attacks against other types of ICS, as I just explained. With the centralization of the management of satellite infrastructure, we can see much more widespread disruption if attackers have the right motivations and resources. I should note that in the attacks that I analyzed, a lot of them were intercepted before they were able to have that widespread consequence. So attackers may have reached the networks, they may have even reached the admin management segments within the networks, but they hadn't actually deployed wider measures, even though they had the resources to then create further disruption based on that. And so the ground infrastructure is particularly concerning in this segment, considering its close link to sort of wider connected infrastructure, even more concerning perhaps than the user segment. And hopefully this research motivates further empirical analysis. And so that takes me to the end of my presentation. That's my information. I'd love to connect and continue the conversation. So thank you very much for joining me for this presentation, and I'm really excited to explore the rest of CYSAC as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. to be Jessie.
Thank you.
Yeah, the presentation was very interesting. Thank you. So I would like to ask the audience if you have any questions to Jessie.
Yeah, at the end you just said that nobody used this to widespread the attack. Why? Why do you think they didn't use it? Is it because, in fact, it was not useful, or is it because it was not interesting enough for them?
That's a good question. Thank you very much. So I think, of course, this is quite speculative because I can't step into the shoes of the attackers. But the way I see it is that, as we have seen in previous attacks as well, before a really sophisticated, disruptive attack occurs, it's quite important for attackers to gain information about the vulnerabilities within a certain system, about the different components within a system, and indeed about the potential that they have for disruption. So you wouldn't, if you were planning a really disruptive event, I suppose it's very helpful to be within the system for a few months and just to sort of sit there and just look at what happens and how different, systems are responded to. So I think it's helpful, especially in terms of collecting data. And I also think that, it's lucky that they were intervened with when they were, because they could well have led to more disruptive attacks. And I would imagine that with the Viasat's CYSAT network attack, I would imagine that attackers were probably able to access the infrastructure before they then conducted the more disruptive attack. I mean, a lot of the what was quite interesting was that a lot of the methods that were used by the attackers to remain in the systems were to use legitimate tools which were already being used by users of those systems. And so that helped them to really remain under the radar, if you like. And so maintaining that access, I think, was probably quite helpful for them. Because, of course, as soon as you conduct an attack, you're known. They know about you and they probably try to remove you. But if you don't, then you can stay there and continue to learn about what's going on.
Okay.
Thanks. Jörg Deutschmann from the University of Nuremberg. Thanks for the excellent talk. I would be curious, how do you get information, or to which extent do you get information from the operators? Because I guess a lot of the incidents won't be made public at all.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you again for that question. Something that I didn't emphasize in my presentation was that the data that I used was all open source. So what I was able to analyze, and maybe in some ways why I've been speaking slightly vaguely, is because companies within the satellite industry, but also, it's a problem within a lot of other types of industries as well, is that companies often do not want to disclose specific information about how they were compromised, and there are good reasons for that. It does, there is potential for damaging reputation if it becomes clear that an attacker was able to get onto their system, maybe through through any means actually, because it's embarrassing, right? And so the data that I was able to get was that which was made published, and it was just reports by private companies that sort of looked into the attacks, and then some of the language was rather broad. But I think that what's important here, especially with events like this, is that slowly but gradually the area of cybersecurity and satellite systems is becoming more public. And I think that that's really exciting, and hopefully what that means is that slowly over time more data, more information will be released in relation to these types of cyber attacks, but also generally about cybersecurity and satellite systems, because it's an area that's often been within the military and kind of government realms, which has meant that a lot of the data has been kept quite private. But slowly but surely, especially as we use space more, with the development of new space, hopefully, these vulnerabilities will become more public, and then publicly analyzable by researchers like me.
Okay, thank you. We have a couple of questions from the app. So we have this question from Brendan. He says, are you aware of MITRE? I hope I'm I'm pronouncing it the best way. MITRE's pivot concept, platform independent vectors of technique, which promotes combining multiple TTP frameworks like ATT and acknowledgement for enterprise with ICS or enterprise with Sparta.
Oh, thank you, Brandon. I was not actually aware that MITRE has a pivot concept, although I was aware of their multiple frameworks and also Sparta. And just to provide some more information, which, by the way, I'll take note of that. So thanks again, Brandon. I will definitely take note of that. But the reason why I chose MITRE for ICS rather than Sparta is, of course, more closely looking at attacks specifically within the space and aerospace industry, whereas MITRE for ICS is a bit more focused, I guess a bit more general in terms of the type of infrastructure, but maybe a bit more specific in terms of the number of different attack types that can be encapsulated within analysis. And so for this one, I wanted to emphasize more on the cyber side of these attacks, and I wanted to look at the different the kind of details related to cyber attacks. Whereas if I'd wanted to focus more on the space infrastructure and maybe unraveling more of the vulnerabilities related specifically to space infrastructure, I guess I could have picked Sparta or even combine the two. So yeah, thanks for a third time. Thank you, Brandon. I will keep note of that concept.
Okay, just a second, I will come back to you because I have another question on the app which is linked to this question. It's from Ismail, and basically he says, do you plan to enhance your research and perform the same mapping based on Sparta and or ESA Space Shield frameworks?
So thank you, Ismail. Thank you very much for the question. So essentially this research that I presented today is a shorter study that's emerged from a longer study which I did, which used more detailed methods to break down the attacks and the different stages within them, and also some incidents as well, to look at what happens specifically when there is disruption with satellite systems. So I'd say, but that longer study is what I did before I did the shorter study. And so I was quite interested by the outcomes that emerged from the shorter study, which really used the attack frameworks to map the attacks. And so I would be interested in looking into, how the outcomes might vary if I used a different type of framework. For example, if I did use Sparta, it might be interesting to see if different vulnerabilities emerge, what kinds of vulnerabilities emerge. So that's definitely something that that I'd be interested in maybe doing. But it did. This particular paper emerged from a longer study, which used a completely different type of framework again.
Okay, so we have a last question here.
Thank you. Pierre Codis, key factor, cryptographic solution. So I'm just wondering, in this particular attack, are you aware of if the attackers, they could gain access to, for example, some cryptographic assets like signing keys or encryption keys or, or private keys for a digital certificate, these sort of things?
Thank you for that question. That's interesting. So what I can tell you is that at least in one of the attacks, at the time that the attackers were within the system, there was unencrypted SCADA data being transmitted. And so they could well have had access to that SCADA data, which, of course, if it's SCADA, then it's relating to the operations which are taking place within that infrastructure, and maybe information about the specific hardware and software involved as well. And so I don't know in regards to the specific cryptographic keys, because that comes back to one of the other questions in relation to the level of detail about in terms of what was released about the attacks. And so I would have to double, triple check my findings just to make sure. But I don't think there was a lot of detailed information about that, because just like with the other attacks, it would be quite embarrassing if they had managed to get into supposedly encrypted data, because that wouldn't look very good for the company in terms of, responsibly protecting the data that they use. So thank you for that question. That's an interesting perspective.
Okay, thank you everyone, and thank you Jessie for the very nice talk.
Thank you. It's been brilliant.